The most valuable person in the city was lying on a freezing sidewalk, and nobody even looked down. Snow drifted through the streets of downtown Columbus, Ohio, turning the sidewalks white beneath the glow of streetlights. People hurried past with their heads lowered against the cold. Some carried shopping bags. Others rushed toward warm apartments and waiting families. Nobody wanted to stop. Nobody wanted to be late. And nobody paid much attention to the man sitting alone near a closed bus stop shelter. Grace Sullivan pulled her coat tighter as she stepped out of the community clinic where she worked. It had been a long day. 2 nurses had called in sick. The waiting room had been full from morning until evening. Her feet hurt. Her shoulders ached. All she wanted was a hot shower and a few hours of sleep before another shift began. She adjusted the scarf around her neck and started walking toward her apartment 6 blocks away. The wind pushed against her face as she crossed an intersection. That was when she noticed him. At first, he looked like any other homeless man people passed every day without a second thought. His dark coat was covered with snow. His head hung low. He sat completely still on the bench beneath the bus shelter. Several pedestrians walked around him without stopping. One woman glanced his way before continuing down the sidewalk. A delivery driver stepped around him without slowing down. Grace kept walking for another 10 feet before something made her stop. She looked back. The man had not moved. A strange feeling settled in her stomach. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was experience. Years of working in healthcare had taught her that sometimes people needed help long before they asked for it. She turned around and walked back toward the shelter. "Sir," she called gently. No response. She stepped closer. "Are you all right?" The man lifted his head slightly. His face was pale. Exhaustion showed in every line of his expression. He looked to be in his late 30s. His eyes were unfocused. For a moment it seemed like he was trying to answer, but could not find the energy. Grace immediately crouched beside him. "You do not look well." The man gave a faint smile that disappeared almost instantly. "I have been better." Even his voice sounded tired. Grace touched the back of her hand lightly against his forehead. The temperature startled her. "You have a fever." He looked away. "I will be fine." She almost laughed. It was the kind of answer people gave when they were definitely not fine. Snow continued falling around them. The temperature had already dropped below 25 degrees Fahrenheit. Staying outside all night in his condition would be dangerous. Grace studied him more carefully. Something felt unusual. His clothes were worn from travel and bad weather, but they were high quality. His posture did not match someone accustomed to living on the street. Even exhausted, he carried himself differently. Still, none of that mattered. What mattered was that he needed help. "Can you stand?" she asked. The man hesitated before attempting to rise. He made it halfway before losing balance. Grace caught his arm immediately. "Okay," she said. "That answers that question." A small look of embarrassment crossed his face. "Sorry. Do not apologize." She glanced toward the empty street. "Do you have anywhere to go?" The silence that followed told her everything. Grace closed her eyes briefly. Logic told her this was a terrible idea. Bringing strangers home was not something responsible adults did. Every safety lecture she had ever heard was practically shouting inside her head. Yet when she looked at the man again, all she saw was someone who had been abandoned by everyone else walking past. Slowly, she unwound the thick wool scarf from around her neck and handed it to him. "Here." He stared at it. "You need it more than I do." "Trust me," Grace said. "I have another one at home." The man accepted the scarf after a moment. His fingers tightened around the fabric. Something about the gesture seemed to affect him more than she expected. "Why are you helping me?" he asked quietly. Grace shrugged. "Because somebody should." The answer was simple, honest, and completely unexpected. Together, they began walking toward her apartment through the falling snow. Grace supported part of his weight as they moved slowly down the sidewalk. Neither of them realized that this ordinary act of kindness would soon change both of their lives forever. Grace's apartment was small enough that visitors could see nearly every room from the front door. A narrow kitchen sat beside a modest living area. A worn gray sofa faced an old bookshelf filled with novels, medical textbooks, and sketch pads. The entire place measured less than 700 square feet, but it was warm, clean, and welcoming. To Ethan Whitmore, it felt more comfortable than some of the luxury penthouses he had owned. Grace helped him inside and immediately pointed toward the sofa. "Sit down before you fall down." Ethan obeyed without arguing. He was too exhausted to protest. The moment he sat, he realized how tired he truly was. Every muscle ached. His head felt heavy. The fever still burned behind his eyes. Grace disappeared into the kitchen and returned a minute later with a glass of water. Drink. Ethan accepted it. Thank you. You keep saying that. Because I mean it. Grace offered a small smile before crouching beside a cabinet and pulling out a digital thermometer and a basic medical kit. Occupational hazard, she explained. Nurses tend to collect supplies. Ethan watched her work. Everything she did seemed practical and efficient. No drama. No hesitation. Just quiet competence. A few minutes later, she checked his temperature and frowned. 102 degrees. Ethan leaned back against the sofa. That sounds less than ideal. That sounds terrible. She crossed her arms. How long have you felt sick? He hesitated. A few days. Grace stared at him. That is your polite way of saying more than a week, is it not? Ethan almost smiled. Maybe. Grace shook her head and headed back toward the kitchen. Soon the apartment, filled with the smell of chicken soup warming on the stove. Ethan sat quietly, listening to the ordinary sounds around him. Cabinets opening. Water running. Dishes clinking softly. Strange how comforting normal life could feel. During the previous month, his world had collapsed faster than he thought possible. Business partners he trusted had manipulated company decisions behind his back. Advisors he considered friends had abandoned him the moment problems appeared. People who once filled his calendar suddenly stopped answering calls. The experience had left him emotionally exhausted long before the fever arrived. He had spent weeks moving from place to place, trying to understand how everything had gone wrong. Eventually, even he stopped recognizing the man staring back from mirrors. Grace returned carrying a bowl of soup and placed it carefully on the coffee table. Eat slowly. Ethan looked at the meal. It was simple. Nothing expensive. Nothing impressive. Yet for reasons he could not explain, it affected him deeply. You did not have to do all this. Grace sat in a nearby chair. I know. Ethan studied her. Most people would not bring a stranger home. Most people are probably smarter than me. He laughed quietly for the first time in weeks. The sound surprised both of them. Grace smiled. There it is. What? Proof you are capable of smiling. Ethan lowered his eyes toward the soup. Do not get used to it. For the next half hour, they spoke only occasionally. Grace asked basic questions. Did he have family nearby? Was anyone looking for him? Did he need a doctor? Ethan answered carefully. Not because he wanted to lie, but because he no longer knew who he could trust. No family nearby, he said. No doctor. Friends. Ethan looked away. Not anymore. Grace noticed the sadness hidden inside the answer. She did not press further. Some wounds were obvious even when people refused to describe them. Later that evening, after Ethan finished eating, Grace handed him a folded blanket. You are taking the sofa. Ethan frowned. And where are you sleeping? My room. This feels unfair. You have a fever. Still unfair. Grace pointed toward the blanket. That is not a vote. Ethan surrendered. For a moment silence settled comfortably between them. Then his eyes landed on the scarf she had given him earlier. It rested neatly beside the sofa. He picked it up carefully. I should return this. Grace glanced at the scarf and shrugged. Keep it tonight. Ethan ran his fingers across the fabric. Nobody had given him anything without expecting something in return for a very long time. The realization lingered long after Grace disappeared down the hallway toward her bedroom. Alone in the quiet apartment, Ethan stared at the scarf resting in his hands. Outside, snow continued falling beyond the windows. Inside, for the first time since betrayal had shattered his world, he found himself wondering whether kindness like Grace's still existed everywhere, and whether he had simply forgotten how to recognize it. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the apartment window and painted soft golden lines across the living room floor. Ethan woke slowly, disoriented for a moment before remembering where he was. The fever had eased slightly. His head still ached, but the crushing exhaustion that had followed him for days seemed less overwhelming. He sat up carefully and noticed a folded note resting on the coffee table beside a mug. The handwriting was neat and simple. Breakfast is in the refrigerator. Take the medicine after eating. Do not argue with the note. Grace. For reasons he could not explain, Ethan smiled. He had spent years surrounded by assistants, advisors, executives, and employees. Yet this handwritten note felt more genuine than most conversations he had experienced in months. He walked slowly to the kitchen and found a container of homemade oatmeal, fresh fruit, and another bottle of water. Nothing extravagant. Nothing designed to impress. Just thoughtful. He finished breakfast and took the medicine exactly as instructed. Around noon, the apartment door opened and Grace stepped inside, carrying several grocery bags. "You are awake," she said. "I followed orders." Ethan held up the empty medicine bottle. "Good." She placed the groceries on the counter and glanced toward him. "You look better." "I feel better." "That means you were feeling truly terrible before." Ethan laughed quietly. "Probably." Grace began organizing groceries while Ethan watched. There was something comforting about the ordinary routine. No hidden motives. No negotiations. No expectations. Just a woman returning home after work and preparing for the evening. "You work too much," Ethan said suddenly. Grace looked up. "What?" "You left before sunrise yesterday. You came home exhausted. Then you spent half the night taking care of a stranger. Occupational hazard. That seems to be your answer for everything." Grace smiled. "Maybe." Later that afternoon, she invited him to accompany her on a short walk outside. The fresh air would help, she explained. Ethan reluctantly agreed. Wrapped in his borrowed scarf and winter coat, he followed her through a neighborhood filled with modest apartment buildings and small local businesses. As they walked, people greeted Grace constantly. A grocery store owner waved from across the street. A retired teacher stopped to ask about a community fundraiser. A teenager thanked her for helping his grandmother schedule medical appointments. Ethan noticed something remarkable. Grace knew almost everyone. More importantly, she genuinely cared about them. "You seem popular," he observed. Grace laughed. "That is not popularity. That is what happens when you work in the same neighborhood for years. People trust you." Her expression softened slightly. "I try to earn that." The word trust lingered in Ethan's mind long after the conversation ended. By evening, they returned to the apartment. While Grace prepared dinner, Ethan sat quietly near the kitchen counter. For the first time, he found himself talking about his past. Not the full truth. Not yet. But pieces of it. "I used to run a company," he said. Grace glanced up from the stove. "Used to?" "Something like that." "Big company?" Ethan hesitated. "Large enough." Grace stirred a pot of soup. "And now?" Ethan stared toward the window. Snow was beginning to fall again outside. "Now I am trying to figure out who I am without it." Grace did not immediately respond. Instead, she finished cooking before carrying 2 bowls to the table. Finally, she sat across from him. "People spend their whole lives believing their job title is their identity," she said. Then something changes and they realize they have no idea who they are. Ethan looked at her carefully. "How do you know that?" Grace shrugged. "Because I see it all the time. Illness changes people. Financial problems change people. Loss changes people. The question is whether they let those experiences make them bitter or make them better." Ethan lowered his eyes. The word struck closer to home than she realized. After dinner, Grace settled into a chair with a book while Ethan sat nearby holding the scarf she had given him. Outside, the snow continued falling quietly beyond the glass. Inside, something unexpected was beginning to happen. For weeks, Ethan had viewed the world through the lens of betrayal. Every memory led back to disappointment. Every relationship seemed temporary. Yet sitting in that tiny apartment, surrounded by ordinary kindness, he felt the first small crack appear in the wall he had built around himself. And although he did not know it yet, that crack was where healing would begin. Over the next several days, Ethan's recovery continued faster than either of them expected. The fever disappeared. His strength gradually returned. Yet neither Ethan nor Grace seemed eager to discuss what would happen when he was fully healthy. An unspoken routine had quietly formed between them. Grace left for work each morning. Ethan cleaned the apartment, prepared coffee, and handled small chores while she was gone. In the evenings, they shared simple meals and conversations that somehow felt more meaningful than anything either had experienced in a long time. One Saturday morning, Grace invited him to help at a community outreach event organized by the clinic. Folding tables lined the parking lot behind a neighborhood center. Volunteers distributed winter coats, food boxes, and basic supplies to families facing difficult circumstances. Ethan arrived expecting to stay in the background. Instead, Grace handed him a stack of boxes within 5 minutes. "Congratulations," she said. "You are now a volunteer." Ethan looked down at the boxes. "Do I get official training?" "You are carrying things from one table to another." "Sounds complicated." Grace laughed. The sound stayed with him for the rest of the day. As the hours passed, Ethan watched Grace move through the crowd. She greeted everyone by name. She remembered details about their lives. She listened carefully when people spoke. More importantly, she treated every person with the same respect. It did not matter whether someone was a business owner, a retired teacher, or a struggling parent. Grace approached each conversation with genuine kindness. Ethan found himself studying her from across the parking lot. Years spent in corporate boardrooms had trained him to recognize ambition, to recognize self-interest, to recognize people who calculated every interaction based on personal benefit. Grace was different. She helped because helping mattered to her. There was no strategy behind it, no hidden agenda. The realization unsettled him in the best possible way. Later that afternoon, an elderly man arrived carrying a broken shopping cart filled with belongings. Several volunteers were busy helping others. Before anyone could react, Grace walked over and welcomed him warmly. She found a chair, brought him lunch, and spent nearly 20 minutes listening to his story. Ethan noticed the man's expression change during the conversation. He arrived looking invisible. He left looking seen. "You do that a lot," Ethan said after the man departed. "Do what?" "Make people feel important." Grace looked genuinely confused. "People are important." Ethan stared at her for a moment before looking away. Such a simple answer. Yet somehow it felt profound. That evening they stopped at a small diner on the walk home. Snow still covered patches of the sidewalks, though warmer temperatures hinted that spring would eventually arrive. Sitting in a booth beside the window, they shared coffee and a slice of pie. The conversation drifted naturally between memories, dreams, and regrets. For the first time, Ethan revealed more of his past. Not names, not company details, just pieces of the truth. "A few years ago, I believed success solved everything," he admitted. Grace stirred her coffee. "And did it?" Ethan smiled faintly. "Not even close." She nodded knowingly. "Most people learn that lesson eventually." "You sound very certain." "Because I work with people every day. Some have money, some do not. Happiness rarely follows the same rules as bank accounts." Ethan leaned back in his chair. "You make everything sound simple." "Life is simple." Grace smiled. "People make it complicated." The words stayed with him long after they returned home. That night, unable to sleep, Ethan stood alone beside the apartment window. City lights glowed in the distance. Cars moved through the streets below. Somewhere beyond the skyline, lawyers, executives, and investigators were still searching for him. His disappearance had undoubtedly caused chaos. Yet for the first time in months, he felt no urgency to return. Not because his responsibilities no longer mattered. They did. But because this small apartment had become something he thought he had lost forever. Peace. His gaze shifted toward the scarf hanging neatly beside the front door. The scarf Grace had wrapped around his shoulders on the coldest night of his life. A simple act of kindness. Nothing more. Yet somehow it had become the symbol of everything he was beginning to rediscover. Trust. Hope. Human decency. And as Ethan stood there in the quiet darkness, he realized something else he had not expected. He was no longer just recovering from illness. He was recovering from betrayal. And every day spent with Grace was helping heal a part of him he thought would remain broken forever. By the second week, Ethan could no longer pretend he was simply a guest recovering from an illness. The apartment had started to feel familiar. He knew which cabinet held the coffee mugs. He knew the sound of Grace's footsteps when she returned from work. He even knew which floorboard near the hallway creaked every morning. The realization should have worried him. Instead, it brought a strange sense of comfort. One Friday evening, Grace arrived home later than usual. Snow had finally begun melting, leaving small rivers of water running along the sidewalks outside. Ethan noticed the exhaustion on her face immediately. "Long day?" he asked. Grace dropped her bag beside the door and sighed. One of those days where everyone needed help at the same time. Ethan handed her a cup of coffee he had already prepared. She accepted it with a grateful smile. "You are becoming dangerously helpful. I am trying to repay my debt. You do not owe me anything." Ethan looked down at the coffee mug. That simple statement stayed with him. In his world, everything carried a price. Every favor created an obligation. Every relationship involved expectations. Yet Grace genuinely meant what she said. Later that night, they sat by the apartment window watching the city lights shimmer across wet streets below. The conversation drifted naturally from one subject to another until Grace suddenly asked a question he had been avoiding for days. "What exactly happened to you?" Ethan remained silent for a moment. That is a complicated story. Most important stories are. He stared through the glass. Have you ever trusted someone completely? Grace nodded. Of course. And then discovered they were not who you thought they were? Her expression softened. Yes. Ethan exhaled slowly. That happened to me. Grace waited. People I trusted made decisions that changed everything. Friends. Some. Family. In a way. Ethan chose his words carefully. They convinced me they were protecting something important. Then I realized they were protecting themselves. Grace listened without interrupting. Ethan appreciated that. Most people rush to offer advice before understanding the problem. Grace simply listened. And now? She asked quietly. Ethan gave a small laugh, without humor. Now I am trying to decide whether trusting people is worth the risk. Grace took a sip of coffee before answering. That depends. On what? Whether you want a safe life or a meaningful one. Ethan turned toward her. You make that sound like an easy choice. It is not. She smiled sadly. But every important thing in life involves risk. The conversation lingered in his thoughts long after they said goodnight. The following afternoon, Grace worked a weekend shift at the clinic. Ethan spent several hours alone in the apartment. Around noon, his phone vibrated for the first time in weeks. The device had remained powered off since the day everything collapsed. He stared at the screen. More than 50 missed messages appeared instantly. Dozens of emails. Countless notifications. Several urgent requests from attorneys, investigators, senior executives. One message stood apart from the rest. It came from his longtime chief legal officer. We finally have proof. Call immediately. Ethan read the message 3 times. His pulse quickened. For weeks he had believed the evidence might never surface. Yet here it was. The breakthrough he needed. The first real chance to reclaim what had been taken from him. He should have felt relieved. Instead, he looked around the small apartment. At the bookshelf. At the coffee mugs. At the scarf hanging beside the door. For the first time in years, returning to his old life did not feel like a victory. That evening Grace returned home, carrying groceries. She immediately noticed something different. Ethan stood by the window with a thoughtful expression she had never seen before. Bad news? She asked. Ethan looked at her. Actually, the opposite. Grace set the bags down. Then why do you look worried? Ethan hesitated. The truth sat just beyond the edge of the conversation. He could feel it. He had hidden enough already. Grace, he said slowly, there is something you should know about me. She waited patiently. Ethan took a deep breath. Before everything went wrong, I was not just working for a large company. Grace tilted her head slightly. What do you mean? Ethan looked directly into her eyes. I helped build it. The room fell silent. Grace studied him carefully. You mean you were an executive? Ethan nodded. Something like that. It was not the full truth. Not yet. But it was the closest he had come to revealing who he really was. And somewhere deep inside, Ethan knew the moment was approaching when secrets would no longer be possible. The following morning began like any other. Grace left early for the clinic. Ethan remained behind, staring at the phone resting on the kitchen counter. The messages from his legal team had multiplied overnight. New evidence had surfaced. Internal records had been recovered. Several former associates were finally willing to speak. Everything he had been waiting for was suddenly within reach. Yet instead of feeling victorious, he felt conflicted. During the weeks he had spent with Grace, life had become surprisingly simple. Honest conversations, shared meals, quiet evenings. For the first time in years, he had experienced relationships untouched by status or wealth. Returning to his old world meant risking that peace. Shortly after noon, his phone rang again. This time he answered. The voice on the other end belonged to Daniel Harper, the chief legal officer who had worked beside him for nearly a decade. Ethan, Daniel said immediately. Thank God. We have been trying to reach you for weeks. Ethan walked toward the window. Tell me what happened. For the next 20 minutes, Daniel explained everything. The investigation had uncovered financial records proving that several executives had manipulated company decisions for personal gain. Independent auditors had confirmed irregular transactions. Board members who previously remained silent were now cooperating. Most importantly, the evidence cleared Ethan completely. By the end of the call, one fact had become undeniable. His disappearance was over. He would need to return. That evening Grace came home carrying takeout containers from a small restaurant near the clinic. She immediately noticed the change in his expression. Something happened. Ethan nodded slowly. I finally received answers. Grace sat across from him at the kitchen table. Good answers? Mostly. He hesitated before continuing. The people responsible for what happened have been exposed. Grace smiled. That sounds like good news. It is. Yet his voice lacked enthusiasm. Grace studied him carefully. Then why do you sound disappointed? Ethan looked down at his hands. Because good news usually means change. Silence settled between them. Both understood the meaning hidden inside the sentence. For the first time, the possibility of Ethan leaving felt real. Neither wanted to discuss it. Neither could ignore it. 3 days later, the reveal arrived without warning. Grace was finishing paperwork in the staff lounge during her lunch break when a television mounted on the wall interrupted regular programming with a breaking news report. Several employees glanced toward the screen. One nurse lowered the volume of a nearby conversation. Grace barely paid attention at first. Then she heard a familiar name. Her eyes lifted immediately. The news anchor stood in front of a corporate headquarters building. Behind her appeared a photograph. Grace felt her entire body freeze. The image showed Ethan. Not the tired man she had found in the snow. Not the quiet guest sleeping on her sofa. This Ethan wore an expensive suit. He stood before cameras. Headlines appeared beneath his photograph. Missing millionaire CEO expected to return following major corporate investigation. Grace stared at the screen. The report continued. Ethan Whitmore, founder and chief executive officer of Whitmore Capital. Estimated net worth in the hundreds of millions. One of the most influential business leaders in the region. The room seemed strangely quiet. Grace barely heard the rest of the broadcast. Her mind replayed every conversation they had shared, every partial truth, every carefully chosen answer. He helped build the company. That statement had been true, just not completely true. When her shift ended, Grace drove home in silence. The television report echoed endlessly in her thoughts. Confusion mixed with disappointment. Not because Ethan was wealthy. Wealth itself meant nothing to her. What hurt was realizing how much he had hidden. She opened the apartment door and found him waiting near the window. One look at her face told him everything. You know, he said quietly. Grace nodded. Neither moved. Neither looked away. You are Ethan Whitmore. Yes. The single word carried the weight of every secret between them. Grace set her bag down slowly. The missing CEO. Yes. The millionaire everyone has been searching for. Ethan lowered his eyes. Yes. Silence stretched between them. Finally, Grace asked the question that mattered most. Were you ever planning to tell me? Ethan opened his mouth, then closed it again. Because the honest answer was complicated. He had wanted to tell her. Every day. Yet fear kept delaying the conversation. Fear that revealing the truth would change everything. Now it had. Grace looked toward the scarf still hanging beside the door. The same scarf she had given a stranger on a freezing night. Suddenly nothing felt simple anymore. And for the first time since Ethan entered her life, both of them understood that the hardest part of their story was only beginning. Grace barely slept that night. Every time she closed her eyes, images from the television report returned. The man who had shared coffee at her kitchen table. The man who had helped carry food boxes at community events. The man who had listened to her stories about difficult days at the clinic. And the millionaire CEO whose face appeared on financial news programs across the country. By morning, confusion had settled into disappointment. Not because Ethan was wealthy. Not because he owned companies or appeared in magazines. What troubled her was the distance between what he revealed and what he concealed. When she left for work, Ethan was already awake. Neither mentioned the conversation from the previous evening. The silence between them felt heavier than any argument. At the clinic, Grace tried focusing on patients, appointments, and paperwork. It did not help. Her thoughts kept drifting back to the apartment. Back to Ethan. Back to every conversation they had shared. During her lunch break, she found herself staring out a window instead of eating. One of her coworkers noticed immediately. Everything okay? Grace forced a smile. Just tired. It was easier than explaining the truth. Meanwhile, across town, Ethan sat alone in the apartment. For the first time since arriving there, he felt like an outsider. The space that once felt warm and welcoming now seemed uncertain. He understood why. Grace had offered trust freely. He had responded with half-truths and omissions. Even when his reasons felt understandable, the result remained the same. He had hurt someone who deserved honesty. Around noon, a black sedan parked outside the building. Minutes later, Two members of Ethan's legal team entered the apartment. They carried documents, reports, and schedules. The corporate world had finally caught up with him. The board meeting is scheduled for tomorrow, Daniel Harper explained. The evidence has been verified. Several directors are ready to support your return. Ethan glanced at the paperwork. Weeks earlier, he would have considered this moment a victory. Now it felt strangely incomplete. And after that, he asked. Daniel looked surprised. After that, you take back control of your company. Ethan stared out the window. Right. That evening, Grace returned home to find the apartment unusually quiet. Several folders sat neatly on the kitchen table. Expensive suits hung near the hallway. The contrast between Ethan's two worlds had never been more obvious. For a moment, she stood silently, taking it all in. Ethan appeared from the living room. We should talk. Grace nodded. They sat across from each other at the small kitchen table where they had shared dozens of conversations over the past few weeks. This one felt different. Why did you not tell me? Grace asked softly. Ethan answered honestly. At first, because I did not trust anyone. Grace looked down. And later, Ethan's expression tightened. Later, because I was afraid. Afraid of what? Afraid everything would change. The answer lingered between them. Grace understood it. That was part of the problem. She understood him enough to know he was telling the truth. Yet understanding did not erase the hurt. You should have given me the chance to decide for myself, she said quietly. Ethan nodded. I know. Silence followed. Outside, rain tapped gently against the windows. Spring was slowly replacing winter. Seasons moved forward whether people were ready or not. Finally, Grace stood. You need to go back. Ethan looked up. Grace, your company needs you. Her voice remained calm, but sadness hid beneath it. Your life is waiting. Ethan rose as well. What if this is the life I want? The question caught her off guard. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Grace shook her head. Right now, neither of us knows what we want. Ethan wanted to argue. Wanted to explain that the happiest weeks of his adult life had happened inside this tiny apartment. Wanted to tell her that money, power, and success suddenly felt insignificant compared to a quiet evening sharing coffee with her. But some truths arrived too late. The next morning, before sunrise, Ethan packed his belongings. The scarf remained carefully folded on top of his bag. When he stepped into the living room, Grace was already awake. Neither trusted themselves to say much. Thank you, Ethan said finally. Grace looked at him. For what? Ethan's eyes moved around the apartment one last time. For stopping when everyone else kept walking. A few minutes later, he left. Grace watched from the window as the black sedan disappeared down the street. For the first time since that snowy night at the bus shelter, she felt completely alone. And as Ethan stared out the car window on the drive toward the future he had fought so hard to reclaim, he realized something painful. He had recovered his health. He was about to recover his company. But he might have lost the person who mattered most. The return to Whitmore Capital made headlines across the state. News outlets covered every development. Financial analysts discussed the investigation for weeks. Yet Ethan paid surprisingly little attention to the attention surrounding him. On the morning he walked back into corporate headquarters, hundreds of employees filled the lobby. Cameras waited outside. Board members stood ready inside the executive conference room. Months earlier, he would have viewed the moment as the most important day of his year. Now he found himself thinking about a small apartment 6 miles away and a woman who probably had not watched a single minute of the coverage. The board meeting lasted nearly 4 hours. Independent investigators presented evidence. Auditors confirmed findings. Internal records exposed the decisions that had damaged the company and endangered thousands of jobs. Several executives who had acted dishonestly were removed from leadership positions. Others resigned before formal action became necessary. Throughout the entire process, Ethan remained calm. Not because the situation was easy, but because something inside him had changed. The man who left the company months earlier had been driven by control. The man who returned understood the value of trust. By the end of the meeting, the board unanimously restored his authority as chief executive officer. Applause filled the room. Ethan thanked them politely. Yet when reporters later asked how it felt to reclaim his position, his answer surprised everyone. A company is important, he said, but people matter more. The quote appeared in newspapers the next day. Meanwhile, Grace continued her routine at the clinic. Spring arrived fully across Columbus. Trees began blooming. Neighborhood parks filled with families again. Outwardly, life seemed normal. Yet there were moments when memories returned unexpectedly. A cup of coffee prepared exactly the way Ethan liked it. A business article featuring his photograph. The empty corner of her apartment where his bag had once rested. She told herself moving forward was the right choice. Sometimes she even believed it. One afternoon, several weeks after Ethan's return, a package arrived at the clinic addressed to Grace. Inside, she found a framed photograph from the community outreach event where they had volunteered together. She remembered the day instantly. Volunteers laughing. Families receiving assistance. Ethan carrying food boxes while pretending not to enjoy himself. Attached to the photograph was a handwritten note. No expensive stationery. No corporate logo. Just simple handwriting she recognized immediately. Thank you for reminding me who I wanted to become. Grace read the note twice before placing it carefully inside her desk drawer. Across town, Ethan had begun making changes throughout Whitmore Capital. Employee assistance programs expanded dramatically. Community partnerships received increased funding. Several executives questioned the financial wisdom of the initiatives. Ethan ignored them. He had spent enough years measuring success exclusively through profits. One project became especially important to him. In partnership with local organizations, he launched a network of neighborhood wellness centers designed to provide affordable healthcare resources and educational programs. Construction moved quickly. By early summer, the first center neared completion. During a planning meeting, one of his advisors asked what the building should be called. Ethan looked through the glass wall of his office toward the city beyond. The answer came immediately. Several weeks later, invitations began appearing throughout Columbus. Community leaders, healthcare workers, educators, and local residents were invited to attend the grand opening of a new public resource center. Grace almost declined when she received hers. Her schedule was already full. The event seemed unrelated to her work. Yet curiosity eventually won. On a warm Saturday afternoon, she arrived at the newly completed building located near one of the neighborhoods she served. Hundreds of people gathered outside. Families explored activity booths. Volunteers distributed information. Children played games on the lawn. The atmosphere felt hopeful. Then Grace looked up at the large sign mounted above the entrance. She stopped walking immediately. The Grace Sullivan Community Wellness Center. Her breath caught. For several seconds, she simply stared at the words. Confusion gave way to disbelief. Then she noticed Ethan standing near the entrance speaking with local officials. At that exact moment, he looked up and saw her. The crowd seemed to disappear around them. Neither moved. Neither spoke. Yet the distance between them suddenly felt smaller than it had in months. Because Ethan had reclaimed his company. He had restored his reputation. He had achieved everything he thought he wanted. But standing there beneath the summer sunlight, looking at the woman who had changed his life, he knew there was still one thing left worth fighting for. For a long moment, neither Ethan nor Grace moved. The crowd continued celebrating around them. Children laughed near the activity booths, and local leaders posed for photographs. Yet everything beyond the space between them seemed to fade away. Grace finally walked toward him, stopping only a few feet away. "You named the center after me?" she asked softly. Ethan smiled. "I tried naming it after myself once." Nobody seemed excited. A small laugh escaped her before she could stop it. Hearing that sound again felt like a gift. "You did not have to do this," she said. Ethan glanced toward the building. "Actually, I did." Grace looked at him curiously. Ethan folded his hands. "When I first arrived at your apartment, I thought I had lost a company." He shook his head. What I had really lost was perspective. The warmth in his voice made it difficult for Grace to look away. Together, they walked toward a quieter corner of the property where flowering trees provided shade from the summer sun. For a few moments, neither spoke. The silence no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt honest. "The center is beautiful," Grace finally said. "The community will love it." Ethan nodded. That was the goal. He hesitated before continuing. "But there is another reason I wanted you here today." Grace felt her heart beat a little faster. Ethan reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. For a brief second, she wondered what he was about to reveal. Then she saw it. The scarf. The same wool scarf she had wrapped around his shoulders on that freezing night months earlier. He held it carefully, as if it were something priceless. "You kept it," she whispered. Ethan smiled. "It turns out I am sentimental." Grace looked down at the familiar fabric and felt emotion catch unexpectedly in her throat. It was just a scarf. Ethan shook his head. No, his voice grew quieter. It was the moment everything changed. He looked directly into her eyes. Hundreds of people walked past me that night. You stopped. Grace felt tears beginning to gather. Ethan continued. You did not know who I was. You did not know what I owned. You did not know what I could offer you. He gently unfolded the scarf between his hands. You helped because you cared. The crowd's noise seemed distant now, almost non-existent. Grace, he said, before I met you, I thought success meant having control. Then I lost everything and discovered that the most important things in life cannot be controlled. Grace listened quietly. Trust, friendship, kindness, love. The final word hung softly between them. Ethan took a slow breath. You helped me recover my health. You helped me recover my confidence. Most importantly, you helped me believe in people again. A tear slipped down Grace's cheek. She quickly brushed it away. Ethan smiled gently. The funny thing is that everyone keeps congratulating me for getting my company back. He looked toward the center behind them. But the richest thing I found was never waiting in a boardroom. Grace already knew what he was going to say, yet hearing it still made her heart ache in the best possible way. Ethan stepped closer. It was you. For a moment, neither moved. Then Ethan reached into his pocket again and removed a small velvet box. Grace's eyes widened. Ethan, he opened it carefully. Inside rested a simple, elegant ring. Nothing flashy. Nothing designed to impress headlines or magazine covers. Just something beautiful and sincere. The first time I entered your life, I arrived as a stranger who needed help, he said. The second time, I came back as the man I was supposed to be. His voice grew emotional. I do not want to rescue. I do not want a second chance because I am wealthy. I only want the opportunity to spend the rest of my life proving that what you saw in me was worth believing in. Grace could barely see through her tears now. Ethan held her gaze. Grace Sullivan, will you marry me? The answer arrived instantly. Yes. Her voice trembled. Yes, I will. Applause suddenly erupted nearby as several people realized what was happening. Ethan laughed as Grace wiped away tears. He slipped the ring onto her finger before wrapping the scarf gently around her shoulders. You know, she said through a smile, I think this belongs to me. Ethan pretended to consider it. Fair point. Together, they turned toward the community center bearing her name. Families filled the lawn. Volunteers welcomed visitors. Children ran through the sunshine. It was exactly the kind of place Grace always dreamed of creating. Ethan slipped his hand into hers. Months earlier, she had found a sick stranger sitting alone in the cold while the world walked past without noticing. Now they stood side by side, looking toward a future neither could have imagined. And as the afternoon sunlight warmed the city around them, both understood the truth. Sometimes the greatest fortune a person finds is not money, success, or power. Sometimes it is simply the person who stopped when everyone else kept walking.